Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. If you're one of my students, we've already talked pretty extensively about all the factors that led to the rise of cities in the late 1800s. This video is going to focus on the culture that emerged as a result of urbanization between about 1870 and 1900 or so. This mass popular culture that came about in the late 19th century didn't just happen because people moved to the cities. There were a lot of factors that played into it occurring. Um, it can be traced back to industrialization, which led to higher productivity and more mass production of goods. And as a result of that, the price of those goods goes down to the point where average people can afford them. It used to be if things were made by hand, they were pretty expensive because there weren't that many out there. That's not really the case anymore as more mass production occurs. You also have more people with disposable income as incomes rise in these jobs, and people begin to have more leisure time and stuff like that. A pop culture is going to emerge because people want to do something to fill this new free time that they've got. So as a result, you begin to find what's called a mass consumer culture. And there are a lot of things that come about during this time for entertainment and all that, but this video is going to focus on a few of the highlights. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. In the late 1800s, in urban areas, especially along the East Coast, amusement parks began to emerge. These became really common and popular entertainment destinations on the weekends because, again, for the first time, people have time off. People aren't working on Saturdays as much. So families or anyone really on their day off could head to these parks and ride rides and see lights and all kinds of neat, glitzy stuff that previously really hadn't been commonly available for the masses to take in. The most notable amusement park is Coney Island, which is in Brooklyn in New York City. And Coney Island is not actually one amusement park. At its peak, it was a combination of several different amusement parks that had roller coasters and, again, just things for people to do and have fun doing. Here are a few pictures of the most notable amusement park located on Coney Island at that time, called Luna Park, where you see all kinds of nifty things that probably caused a lot of people newly arrived from more rural areas or from other countries to have kind of a holy crap moment about how glitzy and awesome America was, and these cities, how much they had to offer. You see, electric lights at night on some of the buildings at Luna Park, which at the time was pretty unbelievable, especially if you were new to the city. There are some prototypical roller coasters you see there, as well as opportunities to ride elephants, which is, most people nowadays don't get that opportunity, so that was pretty neat for a lot of people as well. In addition to going and riding rides and all of that, people also pass time by taking in spectator sports. The most notable spectator sport early on was baseball, which was founded around 1840. The first organized game took place in 1846 in New York, where the New York Nine put a hurting on the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, 23-1. Baseball became more and more popular during the Civil War. Soldiers have been documented to have played baseball when they had time during that conflict. And then professional leagues began to emerge after the Civil War, along with a lot of new professional teams that came about. The oldest continuing operating franchise in professional sports today is the Atlanta Braves. They were founded in 1871 as the Boston Red Stockings, and eventually they came to be known as the Braves, and they moved around, and they landed in Atlanta in 1966, moving from Milwaukee. I pull for the Braves, so I'm going to bring them up any chance I get in a U.S. history video. So there you go. Again, National League founded in 1876, American League founded in 1900. They had their first World Series in 1903 when the Boston Americans, known today as the Boston Red Sox, beat the Pirates in a best-of-9 series, 5-3. Around the turn of the century, the rules of baseball changed. It previously had resembled a lot of different European sports, such as rounders and maybe even cricket to an extent and stuff like that. But you began to see at this time swingless strikes, where the umpire can call it a strike without you swinging at it. People actually having to be tagged. Used to be you could just hit somebody with the ball like thrown, and they were out at that. Eventually, you couldn't do that. Overhand pitches used to be underhand. They changed that as well. About the time baseball was ramping up in popularity in the United States, the first ever football game was played. In 1869, Rutgers beat the College of New Jersey, then known as Princeton, 6-4. Mr. Drake, that's a really weird football score, you might be saying. Well, scoring was different back then, and a lot of people who saw this game said it was actually more like rugby, but with some slight adjustments to the rules. Be that as it may, it's considered the first football game. Eventually, throughout the late 1800s, some rules change. You start to have downs to gain a first down. You can't just go forward indefinitely. Eventually, you have to make progress. Snapping to a quarterback, forward passes, all that kind of stuff that didn't exist early on. Colleges began to gain football programs throughout the late 1800s, early 1900s. Most major colleges that were around at the time date the beginning of their football programs to the 1890s, early 1900s, and stuff like that. Professional football, you might be wondering why we're not talking about that. It doesn't really come about until later. 1920 is when the NFL was founded, and most professional football teams after it was founded in the 1920s were in small towns in the upper Midwest, Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Ohio, those areas. The only one of those, small town teams that still exist to this day is the Green Bay Packers. The rest of them either folded or moved other places. Boxing is also big at this time. Used to be it was bare knuckle fighting. Eventually they went to gloves when people were, I have to assume it's because they were getting injured and maimed and all of that. The picture there is of a guy named John Sullivan, who was a well-known bare-knuckle champ, and he won the final bare-knuckle title in 1889 in a bout that went 75 rounds. It's a wonder he lived. But maybe sports weren't your thing. And even if that was the case, there were a lot of performances you could go see if you lived in a more urban area. One of the most notable live performances of this era was Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which was a big spectacle that celebrated America's conquest of the West and sort of creates this creation myth, for the United States and celebrates how important the West was in American culture and American history. And the show eventually went to Europe, so it sort of planted that idea in foreigners' minds as well. Everyone began to, very commonly associate America with Western culture. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show featured Sioux Indians, Annie Oakley, the famous, cowgirl sharpshooter, cowboy musicians. Sitting Bull was even part of it for a time, and this made a lot of money for Buffalo Bill Cody, who was the proprietor of the show. Circuses were also rising in popularity at this time, and circuses weren't limited to big cities. They would tour all over the place, and even people in medium-sized towns would sometimes have the big tent come set up, and you could go in and see all these animals and daredevils and stuff like that. If you couldn't afford tickets to the circus, you could still see the parade of all the animals and people coming into the town, and that was pretty cool for a lot of people too. Culturally, the circus was sort of controversial. Conservatives really hated it because you had women wearing tights and clowns who were sort of off color in terms of the humor that they presented, and you had rambunctious audiences and stuff, and so a lot of people sort of hated it, especially religious types, but it was a lot of fun for a lot of people. And no discussion of mass culture in the late 1800s is complete without talking about all the stuff you could buy. This is the era that saw the rise of the department store, or as it was known in some places, palaces of consumption. And by consumption, we mean buying things, not tuberculosis. The most notable and famous department store to this day is Macy's, which was opened in the late 1800s in New York City. You had them in other cities too, Marshall Field's in Chicago, Wanamaker's in Philadelphia. These places were awesome, these department stores in the big cities. They were centrally heated, they were lit up well on the inside, and they offered up for sale these beautiful products that you normally wouldn't have available to the masses previously. But again, higher productivity, more production is going to lead to a decrease in prices to the point where average people can buy this stuff. Macy's in New York started off being a store with primarily like luxurious clothing, but eventually it moved on to other stuff. Rubber boots, dog collars, telescopes, all kinds of stuff. People said that Macy's was like a bazaar, a museum, a hotel, and a fancy store all sort of rolled into one. Early on, these department stores were nifty, but they weren't available outside the cities in which they were located until 1872, when Montgomery Ward started the first mail order catalog. This was the official supply store of farmers out west. Organization called the Farmers Grange promoted Montgomery Ward as a place for people to buy things from. These catalogs would be mass mailed out to people in rural areas, and they could look through them at home, and there was a little something for everybody in there. Women could look at the clothing, and men could look at the mechanical reapers or whatever. And they could send their order forms into these stores, and then all the stuff would just get shipped west, and it brought those stores and those modern conveniences to their door. The biggest example of mail order catalogs would have to be Sears and Roebuck. Montgomery Ward had a monopoly on it for a while, and then Sears came about, and Sears was real big in the mail order catalog business and was known for it into the 1990s when internet sort of took over. But it was said that Richard Sears, the proprietor of Sears and Roebuck in Chicago, could sell fresh air. Like, he was just quite the salesman and was able to advertise and promote his goods and sell it to anybody. If you're one of my students, we're going to be spending tomorrow or the next day after you watch this video for homework in class looking at some examples of mail order catalogs and advertisements from that time, and we'll talk about why they may have been so effective. That'll do it for today. Make sure you're keeping up with your reading and assignments if you're one of my students, and if you have questions, feel free to ask them in class or post them in the comment section below. Cheers!